With tonight's focus being on research, we thought we would do some core logic slides, which is really where we gather a lot of our information. When we're interested in where the market's at, we call on core logic to do property reports or get some of this data in regards to where the market's at, what the experts are saying. So let me dive into it. So obviously, common knowledge is that values are dropping, but just by how much and where are they dropping is what's interesting about this slide. So obviously across the 12 months, the combined capitals have slowed down. But what's interesting is the regional markets have remained quite buoyant through the last 12 months, where the combined capitals have obviously dropped. Sydney's dropped by 4.2%. The stunning, outstanding performer has been Hobart, that's had 12.7% growth in the last 12 months. So I guess it's an interesting fact that we can see that the regionals have continued their growth as a hangover from the growth in the capitals. It's pushed out from the capitals. So that's what I find interesting out of this slide, and that Melbourne still produced a growth in the last 12 months of 2.2%, where Sydney went back by 4.2%. So interesting on the growth. I like this slide. Basically what CoreLogic have done is they've grabbed the national values of properties and divided it into 10 sections. So they've basically taken the cheapest properties are in the first section and the most expensive properties are in the 10th section. And then they've looked at what are those individual performances of those different sections. And what it shows is that the most expensive properties have had by far the largest drop in value. So when we talk about it month in, month out, that there's markets within markets, this is a clear example that the top end of town has dropped large, and the middle is actually performed quite well in the last 12 months. So you can't hang your hat on 4.2% drop in Sydney and think that the whole place has fallen by that amount, because largely it's the big end of town that's come down, whereas the middle road has actually performed quite well and have actually had some growth in the last 12 months. So that's interesting. So the blue is the last quarter and the black is the last 12 months. So interesting. Sydney. Last quarter for Sydney was a 0.9 drop, and the 12 months, as we've said, is 4.2% lower. And it's 4.5% lower than the peak, and the peak was in July 2017. So we've come back 4.5% from the peak. Melbourne. So Melbourne was 2.2 higher, but what jumps out at me with these stats is that the last quarter Melbourne's actually come back. So Melbourne's come back by 1.2% in the last quarter. So obviously it's trending down now. So an article came out today that ANZ have readjusted their housing figures to say that Melbourne and Sydney readjusted what they think is going to be the drop in Melbourne and Sydney, and they're saying 10% now. So based on the figures, they're saying, you know, Sydney's gone 4.5% from peak to trough, and Melbourne's got a long way to go. That's obviously banks being conservative. Banks, you know, are they trying to scare the valuers? Are they trying to push opinions? Who knows? But that's what happened today. Is that was an adjustment that ANZ made. I think it's just their forecasting. They've got a housing forecast, and they readjusted their housing forecast. The economists for ANZ did that today. Yeah. Brisbane, whole lot of nothing in Brisbane. So 0.2% growth in the last quarter, 0.9 in the last 12 months. But what is interesting in this slide is that houses went up by 1.2% while rents came back slightly. So on units, units came back slightly while houses went 1.2%. So land has moved in Brisbane slightly, whereas potentially the oversupply coming and the unit market demand has seen a fall in the unit prices in Brisbane. Rental growth, we're not seeing a whole lot of rental growth in the capitals. Combined capitals is the black line, whereas the combined regionals is the blue line. So regional cities rent growth, so rent growth is remaining around about that 3% mark, whereas in the combined capitals, it's actually coming down, getting towards zero growth on your rentals. Sydney in particular is 0.5% growth in the last 12 months, while Hobart has seen 11.2%. So I've just got a property empty in Minto, and I would be happy to take the same rent that I had the last tenant paying. So whereas I'm sure Paul would tell you, if I had a Hobart property with a 12-month lease coming up and I had 300 on it, I wouldn't be happy with 300 again. I'd be looking to try and get your 330 out of the next lease. So it's important to know your numbers and know where your properties are and whether to push for a rent increase or take what you can get when you can get it. So interesting numbers. Perth is quite stable there as well. So that was an interesting one in terms of rental amounts aren't dropping a whole lot in Perth over the last 12 months as well. Interest rates. So interest rates have been on hold for a long time now, and rates that we're seeing for owner-occupied loans are as cheap as they've ever been. And over the last 18 months, I guess we've spoken so much about the investment market and the differential at times over the last 18 months has been 1% difference between your owner-occupied rate to your investment rate. What we're seeing now, and I don't know whether it's the APRA 10% hurdle has been removed from the banks, which it has, but we're now seeing rates on investment loans much closer to your owner-occupied loans. So doing a review for a client this afternoon, he had a reasonable St George loan 3 years ago, 5.37 interest-only investment, which is where we see a lot of people sort of sitting with their investment interest-only loans. We're in a position now where the bank came straight back at 4.97 when we pushed them, so 0.4 of a drop within 5 minutes. But to push harder is what we're going to do, because interest only, he can get 4.29 interest only on his investment, and if he's willing to take principal and interest, he can actually get 3.89 on a principal and interest repayment on an investment loan. And owner-occupied rates are at 3.59, 3.69 as the cheapest. So the differential really is only sort of 20 basis points now, whereas previously we've been talking about a gap of 100 points, 1%. So interest rates are cheap, and I guess the message is that your investment rates should be reviewed. If you haven't reviewed them, review them. Your owner-occupied rate you should be paying as cheap as you've ever paid, because they are as cheap as you've ever seen.